All right, in this first video on Singer's argument, what I first want to do is just give you a case that motivates Singer's main point, his main conclusion, and then I want to talk about the case. So we're not going to get into the down and dirty of his argument yet, but we're just going to talk about the case and how you might respond to it, and then we'll briefly broach what that means for the argument at the end of it. So let me give you the case. Okay, so imagine that you're walking in the countryside or in a rural area. Maybe you are in a national forest. I'm thinking in my mind of Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. That's about 40 minutes. We can get into the forest about 30 minutes from my hometown. It's maybe, especially if you're outside of hunting season, largely abandoned. It's national forest land. There's a trail, a 20-mile trail running through it that's awesome to hike. Little ponds, things like that. Great place to go if you're outdoorsy. You should try it. However, I'm imagining walking through some spot in the Davy Crockett National Forest. And let's even assume that you're off of that trail. That's called the 4C trail, which can at times have some traffic on it. Not high traffic, but some. So let's imagine not only that you're in the forest, but you're even away from the trails. It's a huge national forest, huge. And at probably most parts of it, you are incredibly unlikely to see another person. You're walking around in the forest, you're just whatever, very off the beaten path, trying to have yourself a little nature experience or something. And you see, you don't know why, you see a child in a pond, a very small child in, let's call it a very small, shallow pond. But this child is so small and so young, let's say year and a half, 2 years old. Let's call it younger. I'm thinking this child is unable to in any way save themselves. So let's say actually 5 to 6 months. So it's a baby. So this is a child that will not be able to save itself from drowning. And it is drowning in a very shallow pond, call it 2 feet deep. And the child will not be able to save itself. And you are incredibly sure, almost certain, that you are the only person around. And so therefore the only person around that will be able to save this baby. Okay, pond is 2 feet deep. You can wade into the pond. The kid is only, call it 10 feet out into the pond from the shoreline. It's more of a puddle anyway. You can wade in. You'll get the bottom of your pants, maybe up to your knees wet, and your shoes will get wet. Let's say it actually ruins your shoes for whatever reason. Most people don't wear shoes that could be ruined by getting wet now, but let's say they're suede or something else that would be ruined by getting wet. Don't ask me why you're wearing suede out in the middle of Davy Crockett National Forest. But anyway, so you have this opportunity. The cost to you is very low. You ruin, let's call them $50 pair of shoes. You have to walk out of the woods with wet feet, or maybe take your shoes off and let them dry for a little bit. But the benefit is you get to save a child's life. Okay, so here's the question I want you to consider about this case. Do you have a moral obligation to save the child's life? Knowing those facts about the case. You're the only one around that can save the kid. The kid will die without your help. If you save it, it will live a normal life. It's not, it hasn't been in the water for very long. And all it's going to cost you is wet feet and ruined $50 shoes. So it'll cost you $50 and some discomfort, essentially. So question, do you have a moral obligation? Have you done something wrong if you keep walking and don't save the kid and the kid dies? Answer, I don't even have to wait for your answer, even if that would make sense, because y'all can't respond. It is wrong. It's deeply wrong. You're a horrible person if you do that. It is unquestionable that this is true, I think. Anyone that tried to argue with me that you haven't done something wrong in walking by, I would accuse of being a troll. So this is deeply wrong. So there's the case. Let me share my screen for a minute. I gave you the case. it looked like the answer is clear cut. You've done something deeply morally wrong if you do not ruin your shoes and save this kid. So there's the case. There's the question. You can take a look at it. Pause the video if you really want to inspect it there for a second. Okay, now here's the question. Let me ask you two questions, in fact. One is, does distance from someone in need make a moral difference to the case? So does it matter whether someone is closer or further from you? Could that make a difference to whether you have a moral obligation to save them? The second question is, could it make a moral difference if lots of other people are around who could help the person in need? Now, in both of those questions, I'm giving them to you in the abstract first, and now we should probably talk about them in relation to this particular case. Here's why these are relevant questions. It looks like what's going on in this case is you could save this child's life at relatively low cost to yourself. There is no one else that could save this child's life at all, much less at low cost. And that's what makes it the case that you morally ought to save this kid. Here's the problem. There are tons of kids right now in the world that will die without your help, and all it will cost you is $50 and possibly a little discomfort, but probably not even that, given the internet, right? So we could kind of take this for granted. We could talk about it a little bit more. The thought behind this is lots of the problems that are causing people to die and causing children to die in the world right now are easily solvable problems, at least easily solvable in the short term, right? It might be a long-term, harder problem to solve to re-engineer a country's infrastructure or something like that, or teach a whole society sustenance farming or something like that. But in the short term, which is what we're worried about here, as hopefully will become obvious, it is a very simple and cheap problem to solve many times that is killing people. So one of the things that kills people in the world is diarrhea. It's not a very sexy cause to be advocating for, but it happens, and it happens on a large scale. That diarrhea and kind of, I guess you could call it an epidemic. It's not really a disease. It's more defined symptomatically, is killing lots of people. And that is an incredibly easy and incredibly cheap problem to solve, right? It is a matter of over-the-counter drugs that are outrageously cheap, right? Hunger, again, very simple problem to solve and very cheap problem to solve, right? You can save someone's life, save someone from dying of starvation with a very small amount of money. I'm sure that $50 would do it for who knows how long, but at least a few weeks. And it shouldn't change the fact that you are only saving them for a few weeks. If that baby is going to fall back in that pond in 3 weeks, you still have a moral obligation to save that baby now. Okay, so the problem, as you might be seeing it form up, is that right now there are hundreds of thousands, millions, probably millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of people who will die very soon without your help, and the help that you could give would be very low cost, maybe less than $50 in many cases. And so the question is this, and the question I want you to ponder as we kind of bring this intro video to a close over the next few minutes. It's a disturbing question. Maybe sit there with the discomfort of it for a second and ponder it. What is the relevant difference between the baby in the pond and the person dying of starvation or dying of diarrhea, such that you have a moral obligation to save the baby, but you're not doing something wrong by not donating money to this person who's going to die, whether in America or overseas or whatever? All the commercials we see on TV are people overseas in distant countries, but it's happening in America too. Because if you can't find a big relevant, morally relevant difference, we'll talk more about what that means, but let's just call it for now an important difference between that baby and that person dying of starvation or diarrhea or whatever, then it looks like you're morally wrong for not donating the money to help that person. You're as bad of a person for not donating that money, for not typing in your credit card number, as you are for walking past the pond and letting that baby die. Okay, so it looks like in lots of respects, that's exactly the same situation. Someone is going to die without your help. It's a very cheap problem to solve. It's very easy to solve. In fact, if anything, easier and cheaper in the case of the person dying of starvation or diarrhea or whatever than that of saving the baby. After all, it might be cheaper than $50. It might be less discomfort than having wet feet for the rest or for a few hours. So if anything, you have more of an obligation, it seems, to save these people who are dying of starvation. Okay, that's why I considered these two questions, because you might start, our next task is, after all, to consider what difference there might be that could justify saying it's wrong not to save the baby, but it's not, I'm not a bad person for not donating money to Oxfam. So you might wonder, I'll end after considering these two questions. Well, look, you might say in the first case, the person dying of starvation is way further from me. The baby is, whatever, 30 yards away. We didn't really specify, but it has to be within eyesight, right? There's no one, I look around here, I'm sitting in a closet right now recording this. There's certainly no one fixing to die in eyesight, much less, or even, you know, within 50 yards that I know of at least. And my knowledge is certainly important, certainly a relevant aspect of this. So there's no one that close to me that's fixing to die of hunger or diarrhea or whatever. So you might think maybe distance makes a difference. That's what makes it wrong to leave the baby, but not wrong to donate money to someone 1,000 miles away. It's because they're so far away. Okay, but that's not really satisfying. And here's why. Distance on its own doesn't really make a difference to the morality of your action, right? It maybe used to make more of a difference, but again, not because it was distance, but because it used to be that distance made helping harder, right? It used to be that if someone was further away, it was much harder to help them. It involved more of a cost in terms of whatever, at least your energy and possibly money too. But now it is just as easy, in fact, in many cases, easier to help someone who is further or who is further away, right? We can at least come up with lots of cases. Maybe there are some cases where it'd be harder to help someone who's far away because there's not some charity that serves them, or they live away from the internet or any source of help. But we can certainly come up with lots of cases where it's just as easy to help someone thousands of miles away as it is to help someone 30 yards away, right? For me, it would take, sitting in front of a computer, it would take a few clicks and some typing to enter my credit card number. That's how much it would take to save a life. So it doesn't seem like the distance alone is relevant. It seems like the distance is only relevant when it makes it harder to help, right? It'd be weird to say it's just as easy to help, but they're further away. So that's why it's not wrong. Seems like the distance can only be indirectly relevant to the morality of reaction. And in this case, all the factors that distance could affect are not affected, right? It's actually just as easy to help someone. And so where it's just as easy, the distance doesn't matter at all. So on the other hand, you might say, well, wait a second, here's another big difference between the baby in the pond case and the starvation case or the diarrheal case. It seems like there's a ton of people that could save the starving person in addition to me. And that's why I asked the second question. Does it make a big moral difference, or does it make any moral difference if there are lots of other people who are aware of the person in need and who could help? That is certainly a difference between these two cases, just like it was a difference between these two cases that there's greater physical distance between you and the person you could help. The question is it a relevant difference? And what I mean by that is, could it make a difference to the rightness or wrongness of your potential action? And there's reason to worry that it doesn't. Because here's the thing. Regardless of whether there are other people who could help, you can be utterly sure that there's a person you could help who will die regardless of how many other people could help. Right? Because you can be virtually certain, at least as certain as you can be in the case where the baby is drowning, that no one else is going to help. right? I said you're virtually certain in the case with the baby drowning that no one else was going to be able to help. You can't be totally certain, right? There might be someone snorkeling underneath the surface of the water or something. There might be someone hiding over beyond the berm of the little pond or whatever, or hiding behind a tree or something, or whatever, you know, in a ghillie suit in a bush somewhere, right? It could be. It's very, very unlikely given what you observed, given what you know of the area, right? If you had to assign a probability to it, it would be well under 1% possibility or probability that there was someone else who could help, right? And similarly, what is the probability that the person, or that when you go to donate to Oxfam or whatever, some other charity that's going to save people from starving, what is the probability that enough people are going to help in the next moment that no one will die without your action? That your action wouldn't save another life. It would have to be that enough people suddenly decide to donate that there's no one left to save after that, right? Because the relevant question is, could you save a life, right? That's what makes it wrong not to save the baby. It's that you could save a life right here, right? And so in order to not save a life by donating, it would have to be that everybody suddenly decides to be a great person and donate money so that your money doesn't do any good, doesn't save another life. That's not going to happen. If anything, it's less likely than someone hiding behind a tree able to help that kid and planning on it, right? So that when you run up to save the kid, there's already somebody there saving it, right? So the relevant question here is, is there someone able to help, but how likely is it that there will be enough people helping that there's no one left for me to save? And in the baby case and in the starvation case, it's almost certain that there will not be enough people to help, that there will be no one left for you to save. It's not going to be the case that when you run at that baby in the pond, someone gets there before you. There's a teeny tiny little chance, but we don't think that teeny tiny chance makes it the case that you don't have an obligation to save the baby. You're still a horrible person if you don't run over there. And similarly, there's a teeny tiny little chance that enough people will decide to donate that there's no one left to save in the case of worldwide starvation. But we just saw that such a teeny tiny chance doesn't alleviate you of your obligation to help. And so it looks like that doesn't really draw a deep distinction between the baby drowning case and the person starving case. So it looks like we still, after these two attempts, don't have any reason to think that these cases are different. And what that means, and we'll wrap up here, is this is going to launch Singer's argument. What that means is this: we all agreed you have an obligation to save the baby in the pond. And it looks like what that means is you actually have an obligation to be donating money whenever you have it. Whenever you have $50 that's not going to save your life, you have an obligation to donate it, because it's every single time, no matter how many people you save, there's going to be somebody left to save, right? So you have an obligation to donate that $50 in your bank account. And if you have $50 left after that, that's not going to your own sustenance that you were going to spend on a movie, or, you know, gas for your car so you could go hang out with friends or whatever, you have a moral obligation. In fact, you're a bad person if you don't donate it to save that life. Now, this is jarring and disturbing, but that's a conclusion it looks really hard to avoid. Okay. So now let me say this. I'm not accusing you. I'm trying to turn the screws here to make you feel the discomfort of this position, so that we can get down into the argument in the next video and see the details of Singer's argument, where it may or may not go wrong. It's a very powerful argument. I think it's important to see the power of that argument first before we get into the details, and see maybe even some of the discomfort of that argument. Okay, so we'll see you next time.